February 17, 1944, 0545 hours, 90 miles northeast of Truk Lagoon. Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher. F6F Hellcats roll from Essex-class decks into the pre-dawn darkness. The goal is surgical erase roughly 365 Japanese aircraft and 5 operational airfields before the enemy knows death approaches from the sea. The Pacific stretched black and infinite beneath Lieutenant Commander James Ramage as his SBD Dauntless lifted from Enterprise's flight deck, the Pratt Whitney R-1820 engine clawing for altitude in the humid tropical air. Behind him, the greatest concentration of naval striking power in human history spread across 20 miles of ocean, 9 fast carriers launching over 500 combat aircraft in coordinated waves that would rewrite the mathematics of modern warfare in the next 48 hours. Ramage banked his scout bomber into formation, watching the navigation lights of other Hellcats ahead, their 2,000-horsepower double Wasp engines carving contrails against the starfield. The fighter sweep had launched first 90 minutes before dawn, carrying 650 caliber machine guns and the weight of American industrial might toward an enemy that still believed geography could protect them from retribution. Truk Lagoon sprawled 40 miles across, ringed by coral atolls that the Japanese had transformed into their Gibraltar of the Pacific. 5 airfields cut geometric scars into the tropical islands, Eton, Purim, Moan, Dublon, and the seaplane base at Truk proper. For 2 years, these runways had launched Betty bombers and Zero fighters across 1,000 miles of contested ocean, supporting Japanese garrisons from Rabaul to the Marshalls. Today, Operation Hailstone would reduce them to smoking craters and twisted metal. The intelligence was precise, gathered by Marine Corps PB-4Y-1 Liberator reconnaissance flights that had photographed every revetment and fuel dump across the atoll. Roughly 365 aircraft sat dispersed across the airfields, mostly as 6M0s with their legendary maneuverability and paper-thin armor, backed by twin-engine Betty bombers and a handful of newer models. Against them, Mitscher's Task Force 58 brought technological superiority refined by 2 years of combat, radar-directed fighter interception, proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, and aircraft that could absorb punishment the Japanese designs could never survive. The Hellcats reached their approach altitude as the eastern horizon began to pale. Radio discipline held absolute, no transmissions that might alert the enemy to what approached from the darkness. In the lead fighter, Lieutenant Commander William Bonneau checked his fuel mixture and gun switches, feeling the familiar weight of cockpit armor that surrounded him like a steel cocoon. The Japanese pilots below had chosen speed and range over protection. They would learn the price of that decision in the next 6 hours. At 0600, the first fighter sweep crossed the outer coral ring of Truk Lagoon. The 22nd Air Flotilla had stood down from high alert the previous evening, their pilots exhausted after weeks of false alarms triggered by long-range reconnaissance flights. Most of the Japanese aircrews were asleep in their quarters on Dublon Island when the Hellcats appeared over Eton Airfield like apparitions from a technological future. The first burst of 50 caliber fire shredded a line of parked Zeros before their engines had even cooled from the previous day's patrol. Lieutenant Bonneau rolled his F6F into a diving attack on the control tower at Moan, watching tracers reach up toward him from 25mm anti-aircraft guns that had been positioned too late and manned by crews still rubbing sleep from their eyes. The bullets that struck his aircraft, and there were dozens, sparked harmlessly off his armored windscreen and engine cowling. A Zero attempting the same attack would have disintegrated. The Japanese pilots who managed to reach their aircraft faced impossible odds. About 45 Zeros clawed skyward from the 5 airfields, their Nakajima Sakae engines screaming at maximum power, but they rose into a killing field orchestrated by American radar operators who had been tracking aircraft for 3 years. The Hellcats held every advantage: altitude, speed, firepower, armor, and pilots who averaged 300 hours of flight training compared to the 100 hours now standard for Japanese replacements. In a dogfight that lasted minutes, 30 of the Japanese fighters fell into the lagoon or exploded against coral beaches. The survivors fled north toward the Carolines, carrying news that would reach Tokyo too late to matter. By 0630, the fighter sweep had cleared the skies over Truk. Not a single operational Japanese aircraft remained airborne within 50 miles of the atoll. The way lay open for the strike groups already forming up behind them. Lieutenant Commander Poor's Bombing Squadron 10 approached Eton Airfield from the southwest, 24 SBD Dauntless in step-down formation carrying 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs. The Japanese had dispersed their aircraft into camouflaged revetments carved from coral and palm logs, but the Americans had studied reconnaissance photographs for weeks. Every hidden position appeared on their target maps, marked with precise coordinates that turned the coming attack into an exercise in methodical destruction. Poor's Dauntless rolled into its attack dive at 14,000 feet, the airframe shuddering as it accelerated past 300 miles per hour in the controlled plunge that had made this aircraft the most accurate bomber in the Pacific. Through his telescopic sight, he could see Japanese ground crews running between revetments, some trying to start aircraft engines, others manning anti-aircraft positions that would prove inadequate against an attack delivered from such altitude and speed. The 1,000-pound bomb separated cleanly at 2,500 feet, Poor pulling out of his dive as the weapon plunged toward a concentration of Betty bombers parked wingtip to wingtip in what the Japanese had believed was a concealed dispersal area. The explosion lifted 3 aircraft completely off the ground, their fuel tanks igniting in a chain reaction that consumed 8 more bombers and sent a mushroom cloud of burning aviation gasoline 500 feet into the tropical air. Across the lagoon, similar destruction unfolded with mechanical precision. Each task group of Task Force 58 had been assigned specific targets based on detailed intelligence analysis. TG-581 concentrated on Eaton and Perham airfields. TG-582 struck Moan and the seaplane base. TG-583 attacked Dublon and the fuel storage facilities that fed the entire operation. The coordination was flawless, the execution devastating. The Japanese had built their Pacific strategy around the assumption that Truk's isolation would protect it from sustained attack. The nearest American airfield lay 1,200 miles away in the Marshalls, far beyond the range of any land-based bomber. Even carrier aircraft would have to approach across hundreds of miles of open ocean, providing ample warning for defensive preparations. But Task Force 58 represented a new form of warfare, a mobile airbase carrying more firepower than most small nations could deploy, capable of appearing anywhere in the Pacific with minimal warning. Commander Ramage led the second strike against Perham Airfield, his formation of 18 aircraft approaching at masthead level to avoid the anti-aircraft fire that now filled the sky above the lagoon. The Japanese had finally awakened to their situation, manning every gun position from 25mm automatic weapons to elderly 75mm coast defense pieces pressed into anti-aircraft service. The sky filled with black bursts and streams of tracer fire, but the American aircraft flew through it with the confidence of superior armor and proven tactics. The revetments at Perham held newer aircraft in the Japanese inventory, a dozen fighters that had been ferried in from the Philippines the previous week. Their engines were already running when Ramage's strike arrived, pilots attempting to taxi toward the runway through gaps in the explosions that had already cratered the airfield. 1-0 actually became airborne, lifting 15 feet before a 500-pound bomb detonated beneath its landing gear and scattered the aircraft across a square mile of jungle. Ramage selected his target with professional detachment, a cluster of fuel trucks servicing aircraft in a palm grove that intelligence had missed in the reconnaissance photographs. His 1,000-pound bomb struck precisely between 2 vehicles, the explosion igniting thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline in a fireball that incinerated everything within 300 yards. The mushroom cloud rose to 3,000 feet, visible from Task Force 58 20 miles away. By noon on February 17th, the first phase of Operation Hailstone had achieved results that exceeded the most optimistic projections. American aircraft had flown 1,250 individual sorties against Truks airfields and aircraft, destroying an estimated 200 Japanese planes on the ground and shooting down 70 more in aerial combat. Every runway on the atoll had been cratered beyond immediate use. The fuel farms that had supported Japanese air operations across the Central Pacific burned with columns of black smoke that climbed to 15,000 feet. The cost to Task Force 58, 25 aircraft lost to all causes, with most pilots recovered by submarine and flying boat rescue operations already underway. But the destruction of Truk's air power was only the beginning. With the skies clear of enemy aircraft, Mitscher's carriers could turn their attention to the more than 60 ships anchored in the lagoon, merchant vessels, tankers, destroyers, and cruisers that formed the logistical backbone of Japanese operations across 1,000 miles of ocean. The merchant ships had no chance. Caught at anchor in broad daylight by aircraft carrying torpedoes, bombs, and rockets, they died with methodical efficiency. The submarine tender Heian Maru took 3 torpedo hits and sank in 4 minutes, carrying critical spare parts for the submarine force that had been interdicting American supply lines since 1942. The aircraft transport Fujikawa Maru, loaded with Zero fighters and Betty bomber parts, exploded when a 1,000-pound bomb penetrated to her magazine spaces. By evening, about 40 ships rested on the bottom of Truk Lagoon, representing 200,000 tons of shipping that Japan could not replace. The combined fleet's forward operating base had been reduced to a burning wasteland in 8 hours of sustained attack. But Task Force 58 was not finished. As darkness fell over the lagoon on February 17th, Admiral Mitscher authorized a night carrier strike. 12 TBF Avengers from Torpedo Squadron 10 launched from Enterprise at 2,200 hours. Their crews trained in radar-assisted night attack techniques that pushed the envelope of 1944 technology. Each aircraft carried torpedoes and the electronic gear necessary to find targets in complete darkness. Lieutenant Commander William Martin led the night strike, his Avenger climbing through broken clouds toward the estimated position of Japanese ships that had attempted to flee the lagoon during the afternoon. Radar contact appeared on his scope at 28 miles. A large vessel moving north at high speed, probably a cruiser or destroyer attempting to reach the safety of the open ocean. The attack developed like a training exercise. Martin's Avenger approached from the target's starboard quarter, invisible in the darkness, guided by radar returns that painted a precise picture of the enemy ship's course and speed. At 1,500 yards, he released his torpedo, the weapon entering the water cleanly and running true toward a target that had no idea death approached from the night sky. The explosion lifted the stern of the Japanese destroyer Fumizuki completely out of the water, her magazines detonating in a secondary blast that illuminated the ocean for miles. She sank in 3 minutes, taking 180 sailors with her and demonstrating that American naval aviation had mastered warfare in 3 dimensions and around the clock. The night attacks continued until dawn, American aircraft striking targets across 200 miles of ocean with impunity. Japanese ships that had escaped the lagoon found themselves hunted by radar-equipped bombers that could attack from any direction without warning. The light cruiser Naka died under such an attack at 0340 hours, 3 torpedo hits breaking her back and sending her to the bottom with most of her crew. Dawn on February 18th revealed the scope of the disaster that had befallen Japanese forces in the Central Pacific. Truk Lagoon, which had been the combined fleet's primary forward base 12 hours earlier, now resembled a maritime graveyard. 40 ships rested on the bottom, many still burning as aviation gasoline and bunker fuel leaked from their ruptured hulls. The 5 airfields lay cratered and useless, their runways torn by bombs and littered with the wreckage of aircraft that would never fly again. More importantly, large quantities of aviation fuel had been destroyed, fuel that had been intended to support Japanese air operations from Rabaul to the Marshalls for the next 3 months. Without that fuel, Japanese aircraft would be grounded across thousands of miles of ocean, unable to contest American advances that were already being planned from Saipan to the Philippines. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate destruction. Truk had served as a critical link in the supply chain that fed Japanese garrisons across the Pacific. Ships that would normally have refueled and resupplied at Truk now faced journeys of 2,000 miles or more to reach safe harbors. Many would never attempt the voyage, leaving isolated garrisons to slowly starve as American forces advanced island by island toward Japan itself. Admiral Spruance, commanding the 5th Fleet from his flagship New Jersey, studied the damage assessment reports with professional satisfaction. Task Force 58 had demonstrated a new form of warfare that combined mobility, firepower, and precision in ways that traditional naval strategy had never contemplated. A force of aircraft carriers operating hundreds of miles from any fixed base had destroyed one of the enemy's most important installations in less than 2 days, then withdrawn beyond retaliation with minimal losses. The Japanese response to the Truk raids revealed the fundamental shift in naval power that carrier aviation had created. Attempts at retaliation came in the form of small groups of twin-engine bombers flying from distant bases, aircraft operating at the extreme limit of their range against targets that could move at 30 knots and defend themselves with radar-directed fighter aircraft. One bomber managed to torpedo the carrier Intrepid, but the damage was quickly controlled and the ship remained operational. The cost to Japan? 15 more aircraft lost for no strategic gain. The psychological impact of Operation Hailstone extended from the smoking ruins of Truk to the highest levels of Japanese command. For 2 years, the combined fleet had avoided decisive engagement with American forces, husbanding its strength for the crucial battle that would determine the outcome of the Pacific War. But that strategy depended on maintaining control of advanced bases like Truk, positions from which Japanese aircraft could contest American advances and protect the sea lanes that connected the empire to its conquered territories. The destruction of Truk demonstrated that no fixed position was safe from American carrier aircraft. If Task Force 58 could appear anywhere in the Pacific with minimal warning and destroy heavily defended installations in a matter of hours, then the entire concept of static defense became obsolete. Japanese forces would have to concentrate in a few heavily defended positions or risk being destroyed piecemeal by carrier strikes that came from the horizon like hurricanes. Admiral Manichi Koga, commanding the combined fleet from his headquarters in Japan, faced a strategic situation that offered no good options. American industrial production was delivering new carriers, aircraft, and trained pilots faster than Japanese forces could destroy them. Meanwhile, Japan's own aircraft production struggled to replace losses, and the pilot training program that had once produced the world's most skilled naval aviators now graduated replacements with barely enough flight time to find their own carriers, much less engage American pilots who averaged hundreds of hours of combat experience. The mathematics of attrition warfare favored the Americans by overwhelming margins, and Operation Hailstone had demonstrated that Japan could no longer even choose the time and place of engagement. American carriers could strike anywhere, anytime, with a concentration of firepower that no fixed defense could withstand. The strategic paralysis that gripped Japanese naval planning after Truk reflected a broader crisis in the empire's ability to wage modern warfare. The attack had destroyed not just aircraft and ships, but the assumptions upon which Japanese Pacific strategy had been constructed. Distance was no longer a defense. Isolation no longer provided security. The ocean that had once protected Japan from its enemies had become a highway for American power projection on a scale that dwarfed anything in military history. Lieutenant Commander Ramage, leading his squadron back to Enterprise after the final strike on February 18th, could see the smoke columns from Truk rising to 20,000 feet in his rear-view mirror. The sight would stay with him for the rest of his life, not because of its destructive power, but because of what it represented. American industry had produced weapons that could reach anywhere in the world and destroy any target with precision that made resistance futile. The Japan that had attacked Pearl Harbor 26 months earlier had counted on American reluctance to fight a prolonged war across vast distances. That Japan had miscalculated everything: American industrial capacity, American technological innovation, and American determination to carry the war to the enemy regardless of cost or distance. Task Force 58 represented the material expression of those miscalculations, a weapon system that could project power across oceans and destroy the infrastructure of the empire with surgical precision. As Enterprise recovered her aircraft in the gathering dusk of February 18th, Admiral Mitscher was already planning the next operation. The capture of Eniwetok in the Marshall Islands would provide advanced bases for further operations against the Caroline Islands. From there, American forces could advance to the Marianas, placing B-29 bombers within range of Japan itself. Each step forward would be supported by carrier strikes that would clear the way for amphibious forces, just as Task Force 58 had cleared the way at Truk. The pattern was inexorable. American carriers would appear off enemy-held islands, destroy local air power in concentrated strikes, then provide cover for invasion forces that would capture airfields and harbors for use as advanced bases. The process could be repeated indefinitely, limited only by the rate at which American shipyards could produce carriers and American training schools could graduate pilots. Japan's Pacific Empire, conquered in 6 months of brilliant campaigning in 1942, would be dismantled island by a force that grew stronger with each victory, while Japanese resistance grew weaker with each defeat. The mathematical progression was as ruthless as it was inevitable. The wreckage in Truk Lagoon would remain undisturbed for decades, an underwater museum to the day when carrier aviation announced its dominance over traditional naval power. 40 ships lay scattered across the coral bottom, their holds still filled with the supplies that would never reach Japanese garrisons across the Pacific. Aircraft wings protruded from bomb craters like monuments to tactical obsolescence. The fuel tanks that had once fed the combined fleet's air operations lay twisted and empty, their contents having fed fires that burned for 3 days. The most significant destruction was invisible, the collapse of Japanese confidence in their ability to defend fixed positions against American carrier strikes. After Truk, Japanese naval strategy abandoned the concept of forward defense entirely, concentrating remaining forces in heavily protected areas that could withstand sustained attack. That concentration would make the final battles of the Pacific War more costly, but it also ensured that American forces could advance across thousands of miles of ocean without significant opposition. The speed of that advance would astonish even American planners. Within 18 months of Operation Hailstone, B-29 bombers based in the Marianas would be burning Japanese cities with incendiary raids that killed more people in single nights than the atomic bombs that ended the war. The path to those bombers led directly through the smoking wreckage of Truk Lagoon, where Task Force 58 had demonstrated that distance provided no protection against weapons that could cross oceans and strike with the force of natural disasters. Admiral Nimitz, reviewing the final damage assessments from Operation Hailstone at his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, understood that the Pacific War had entered its final phase. Japanese forces could still fight with desperate courage, as they would demonstrate at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, but they could no longer prevent American advances or protect the sea lanes that connected Japan to its empire. The destruction of Truk had eliminated Japan's ability to conduct sustained air operations across the Central Pacific, leaving isolated garrisons to face American assault forces without hope of reinforcement or supply. The political implications were equally significant. Operation Hailstone had been planned and executed while American forces were simultaneously preparing for the invasion of Europe, demonstrating that the United States possessed sufficient industrial and military capacity to wage global war on multiple fronts. That demonstration would influence strategic calculations in Moscow and Berlin as much as it did in Tokyo, establishing American power projection capabilities that would shape international relations for decades after the war ended. The technical innovations that made Operation Hailstone possible, radar-directed fighter interception, proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, damage-resistant aircraft design, and coordinated multi-carrier operations, represented advances that changed warfare permanently. Future conflicts would be fought with weapons and tactics that evolved from the lessons learned in Truk Lagoon, where American technological superiority first achieved decisive results against determined and well-equipped opposition. The human cost of that technological revolution was measured in the pilots who never returned from missions over Truk, the Japanese aircrews who died in aircraft that could not protect them from 50-caliber machine gun fire, and the sailors who went down with ships that had no defense against radar-guided torpedo attacks conducted in total darkness. Their sacrifice purchased strategic advantages that would save thousands of lives in future operations, but the individuals who paid that price would never see the victory their deaths helped achieve. Task Force 58 departed the vicinity of Truk on February 19, leaving behind destruction so complete that Japanese forces made no serious attempt to rebuild the base for the remainder of the war. Occasional supply submarines would reach the atoll with minimal supplies for the garrison, but Truk's role as a major Japanese installation ended with the last American aircraft disappearing over the horizon. The success of Operation Hailstone established carrier aviation as the dominant force in Pacific warfare, relegating battleships to support roles and making traditional concepts of naval power obsolete. Within 2 years, the Imperial Japanese Navy would cease to exist as an effective fighting force. Its carriers sunk and its trained pilots dead in battles where American technological advantages proved decisive. The process that began over Truk Lagoon on February 17, 1944, would culminate with Japanese surrender aboard an American battleship anchored in Tokyo Bay. The lessons learned in those 48 hours of sustained combat would influence military planning for decades. The ability to project power across oceanic distances, strike strategic targets with precision, and withdraw beyond retaliation represented capabilities that no other nation possessed in 1944. American development of those capabilities during the Pacific War established the foundation for global military dominance that would persist through the Cold War and beyond. For the aircrews who executed Operation Hailstone, the strategic implications were less important than the immediate reality of combat against determined opposition. They had flown through anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with deadly metal, attacked targets defended by pilots who fought with suicidal courage, and returned to carriers that represented safety only until the next mission launched. Their professionalism under stress, technical competence in complex aircraft, and tactical flexibility in rapidly changing situations made possible victories that strategic planners had calculated in terms of abstract mathematics. The mathematics proved accurate. American industrial capacity, technological innovation, and military organization created capabilities that Japanese resistance could not overcome, regardless of courage or determination. The destruction of Truk demonstrated those capabilities in terms that could not be misunderstood. American naval aviation could reach any target in the Pacific and destroy it with precision that made fixed defenses irrelevant. Japan's Pacific Empire, constructed on the assumption that distance would protect it from American retaliation, began its final collapse in the smoke and flames that rose from Truk Lagoon in February 1944. The carriers that delivered that destruction were already planning operations that would carry American power to the shores of Japan itself, completing a strategic revolution that had begun with the first aircraft launching from Enterprise's deck in the pre-dawn darkness of February 17. The revolution was technological, strategic, and psychological. It demonstrated that modern warfare belonged to nations capable of combining industrial production, technological innovation, and tactical excellence in weapon systems that could project power across global distances. Japan had briefly possessed such capabilities in 1942, but American advantages in resources, organization, and adaptability proved decisive when the two systems clashed in sustained combat. The wreckage scattered across Truk Lagoon marked more than the destruction of a Japanese naval base. It represented the emergence of American military supremacy based on capabilities that no other nation could match or counter. That supremacy would determine the outcome of World War II and establish the strategic foundations for American global influence in the decades that followed. The Pacific War continued for 18 more months after Operation Hailstone, but its outcome was determined in those 48 hours when Task Force 58 demonstrated that American naval aviation could destroy any target within range of carrier aircraft. That range, extended by new technologies and tactics, eventually encompassed every Japanese installation in the Pacific. The empire that had once seemed invincible found itself defenseless against weapons that struck from beyond the horizon with the force of industrial civilization mobilized for war.